A tow truck driver from Brighton Le Sands has admitted he knew who shot dead former bikie boss Mick Hawi.
The sound of screeching tires echoed through the suburban street as the black sedan pulled up outside the gym. It was February 15th, 2018, and what happened next would send shockwaves through the entire Australian underworld. A man who once ruled Sydney's streets through fear and violence was about to meet his end in the most brutal way possible. This story begins in the concrete towers of Sydney's west, where a young Lebanese immigrant named Mahmoud Hawi would transform himself into one of Australia's most feared enforcers, earning the chilling nickname that would follow him to his grave. The year was 1980, and Australia was a different place. The outlaw motorcycle clubs were still in their infancy, operating in the shadows of society. For 18-year-old Mahmoud Hawi, known to his friends simply as Mick, the world of leather jackets and roaring Harley-Davidsons represented power. Mick wasn't born into violence, but violence seemed to find him wherever he went. Growing up in the multicultural melting pot of Sydney's western suburbs, he learned early that respect had to be earned with your fists. His Lebanese heritage made him stand out in the predominantly Anglo motorcycle scene, but what he lacked in traditional biker credentials, he made up for in raw aggression. The Comanchero Motorcycle Club had been founded by Scottish immigrant Jock Ross in 1968, named after a John Wayne Western. By the time Mick joined in the late 1990s, the club was already establishing itself as one of Australia's most violent outlaw organizations. Ross ruled with military precision, styling himself as the supreme commander and running the club like a private army. Mick Hawi had bigger plans. While other members were content to follow orders and collect their weekly dues from protection rackets and drug dealing, Mick was studying the organization from the inside. He watched how Ross commanded respect, how fear could be weaponized, and most importantly, how power could be seized by those bold enough to take it. For months, Mick worked his way up through the ranks, taking on the dirty jobs that others refused. When rival clubs needed to be taught a lesson, Mick volunteered. When debts needed collecting from businesses that had fallen behind on their protection payments, Mick was the first to raise his hand. Each act of violence added another layer to his growing reputation. The nickname Mick the Knife didn't come from any single incident, but rather from his preferred method of settling disputes. While other enforcers relied on baseball bats or brass knuckles, Mick carried a blade, always sharp, always ready. Fellow club members whispered stories about his handiwork, each tale more gruesome than the last. The knife wasn't just a weapon, it was his calling card. By 2000, Mick had established himself as Ross's most trusted enforcer. The Lebanese community in Sydney's west knew his name, and rival motorcycle clubs crossed the street when they saw him coming. Mick was gathering allies, building a power base, and planning something that would shake the Comanchero Club to its core. The coup came in 2002, and it was as swift as it was brutal. The aging Scottish founder thought his position was secure, that the loyalty he'd built over decades would protect him. He was wrong. On a quiet evening at his home, Mick arrived with several younger Comanchero members. According to police investigator Duncan McNabb, what happened next was comprehensive and violent. Ross was outnumbered and unprepared. The discussion was quick and one-sided. When the dust settled, the former Supreme Commander lay beaten and broken on his own floor. Mick and his allies didn't just take his position. They took his club colors and his prized Harley-Davidson motorcycle. In the outlaw world, it was the equivalent of total humiliation. At just 22 years old, Mick Hawi had seized control of one of Australia's most dangerous criminal organizations. The young Lebanese immigrant, who had once struggled to fit into the Anglo biker world, was now its undisputed leader. He proclaimed himself the new national president and supreme commander of the Comanchero Motorcycle Club. The early years of Mick's reign were marked by unprecedented expansion. Under his leadership, the Comancheros began recruiting heavily from Sydney's Middle Eastern communities, drawing in young men who saw the club as their path to respect and prosperity. The organization evolved from a traditional motorcycle club into something far more sophisticated and dangerous. Mick understood that the future of organized crime lay not in barroom brawls and petty protection rackets, but in large-scale drug importation and distribution. He forged connections with international suppliers, establishing pipelines that would funnel millions of dollars worth of methamphetamine and cocaine into Australian cities. The money flowed like water, and with it came the inevitable attention of law enforcement. The first major test of his leadership came in 2005, following the Cronulla riots. Racial tensions had exploded across Sydney's beaches, and Mick found himself in the unlikely position of calling for peace. He met with other ethnic community leaders, including members of the Bra Boys Surfing Club, in an attempt to calm the situation. That peaceful approach was shattered 2 years later. In November 2007, Mick's car was riddled with bullets outside Grappa Ristorante in Sydney's south. The assassination attempt failed, but it sent a clear message. His enemies were closing in. Rather than backing down, Mick doubled down on his aggressive approach. He began traveling with heavily armed bodyguards and sleeping in different locations each night. The turning point came on March 22, 2009, at Sydney's Kingsford Smith Airport. What started as a chance encounter on a flight from Melbourne would explode into one of Australia's most shocking public displays of motorcycle club violence. Mick and Derek Wainohu, the national president of the Hells Angels, found themselves on the same plane. Old rivalries and territorial disputes boiled over into heated words. By the time they landed in Sydney, both men had sent text messages to their respective clubs, calling for backup. Passengers and staff watched in horror as members of both clubs faced off in the departure lounge. What began as shouting quickly escalated to physical confrontation. Metal bollards were grabbed and wielded like medieval weapons. Blood splattered across the polished floors as the two groups tried to destroy each other. In the middle of the mayhem, Anthony Zervis, brother of a Hells Angels member but not a club member himself, found himself surrounded by Comancheros. Security cameras captured every horrific moment as he was beaten, kicked, and ultimately killed with a 17-kilogram metal bollard. Mick didn't deliver the fatal blow, but as the leader of the Comancheros, he bore ultimate responsibility. As sirens wailed in the distance, he looked directly at Peter Zervis, the dead man's brother, and delivered a chilling threat. "You're dead. You're going to have bullet holes through you the next time we see you." The airport brawl marked the beginning of the end for Mick's reign of terror. Within hours, the footage was playing on every television screen in Australia. The brutality of the attack, carried out in broad daylight in front of dozens of witnesses, horrified the public and galvanized law enforcement. Strikeforce Raptor was created specifically to target outlaw motorcycle clubs, and Mick Hawi was their #1 priority. The investigation was relentless and thorough. Phone records, security footage, and witness testimony all pointed to the same conclusion. Mick had orchestrated the violence that led to Anthony Zervis's death. When the handcuffs finally clicked around his wrists, the man who had once seemed untouchable appeared almost relieved. In November 2011, Mick Hawi was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. The Lebanese immigrant who had clawed his way to the top of the criminal underworld was facing the rest of his life behind bars. Even from behind bars, he remained a powerful figure in the Comanchero hierarchy. Younger members made pilgrimages to visit him, seeking his blessing for major decisions. His wife Carolina visited him every single day of his 6-year sentence, maintaining the connection between the imprisoned leader and his criminal empire. In May 2014, Mick's legal team achieved a stunning victory when the murder conviction was overturned on appeal. The court ruled that the evidence didn't support a murder charge, and a retrial was ordered. Eventually, he pleaded guilty to the lesser charge of manslaughter and was sentenced to a minimum of 3.5 years in prison. When Mick walked out of prison in 2017, he claimed to be a changed man. He told reporters and anyone who would listen that he was done with the outlaw life. He wanted to focus on his family, his 3 young sons, and building a legitimate future. His wife Carolina supported this narrative, telling journalists that her husband had undergone a complete transformation during his time behind bars. For a few months, it seemed like the rehabilitation might be genuine. Mick kept a low profile, avoided his former associates, and appeared to be making an honest effort to build a normal life. He started working out at a gym in Rockdale, maintaining the physical fitness that had always been part of his intimidating presence. In the violent world Mick had inhabited for so long, retirement wasn't an option. His former position as Comanchero president had been filled by other ambitious criminals, but his legacy and his knowledge of club secrets made him a permanent target. Rival factions within the club saw him as a threat to their authority. Enemy clubs viewed him as an opportunity for revenge. Law enforcement agencies continued to monitor his every move. The threats escalated throughout 2017 and early 2018. Carolina later revealed that she lived in constant fear, knowing that her husband's past would eventually catch up with him. She begged him to move the family overseas, to start fresh somewhere his reputation couldn't follow. February 15, 2018, started like any other day. Mick followed his usual routine, kissing his wife goodbye and heading to the Fitness First gym in Rockdale for his afternoon workout. The gym had become his sanctuary, one of the few places where he could focus on something other than looking over his shoulder. He parked his luxury Mercedes in the parking lot and walked inside, unaware that he was being watched. The gunman had been tracking his movements for weeks, learning his patterns and waiting for the perfect opportunity. They knew about his gym routine, his preferred parking spot, and the approximate time he would emerge from his workout. Everything had been planned with military precision. At approximately 12:10 p.m., Mick finished his workout and walked back toward his car. The black sedan that had been waiting in the shadows suddenly roared to life. Two masked figures emerged, moving with practiced efficiency. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final words or pleas for mercy. The assassination was swift and professional. Multiple gunshots echoed across the parking lot as Mick tried desperately to reach the safety of his vehicle. The man who had once terrorized Sydney's streets with a knife was cut down in broad daylight, his blood mixing with the asphalt of a suburban parking lot. When the police arrived, they found Mick Hawi slumped against his Mercedes, his body riddled with bullets. The feared enforcer who had once seemed invincible was dead at the age of 37. The black sedan and its occupants had vanished into the afternoon traffic. The investigation into Mick's murder would stretch on for years, with numerous arrests, but few convictions. Ahmed Dudar and Yusuf Nazlioglu were eventually charged with his killing, but both were acquitted in 2020. The court ruled that while they may have been involved in planning the assassination, there wasn't sufficient evidence to prove they were the actual shooters. The identity of Mick's killers remains officially unknown. Some blame rival Comanchero factions seeking to eliminate a potential threat to their leadership. Others point to enemy clubs settling old scores from the airport brawl 9 years earlier. A third theory suggests that Mick's murder was connected to his knowledge of club drug operations. Mick Hawi's death marked the end of an era for the Comanchero Motorcycle Club and Australian organized crime more broadly. His rise from immigrant teenager to feared enforcer to imprisoned leader to murdered exile tells the story of modern Australian organized crime. It's a tale of ambition and betrayal, of the inevitable price that comes with a life built on fear and intimidation. Carolina Hawi, now a widow with 3 young sons, has spoken publicly about the devastating impact of her husband's choices. She acknowledges that Mick made terrible mistakes during his time as Comanchero president, but she also insists that he was genuinely trying to change in his final years. Her children will grow up knowing their father as both a feared criminal and a murdered victim. The Comanchero Club continues to operate, but it has never fully recovered from the chaos of Mick's era. Leadership changes hands regularly, often violently. The organization that once seemed poised to dominate Australia's criminal underworld has fractured into competing factions, weakened by constant law enforcement pressure and internal conflict. Mick's story serves as a brutal reminder that in the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, there are no clean exits and no happy endings. The young Lebanese immigrant who thought he could control violence through intimidation and fear ultimately became its final victim. The man known as Mick the Knife had spent his adult life believing that force was the answer to every problem. In the end, force was also the question he couldn't answer when it came calling for him. His legacy lives on in the shattered families of his victims, the ongoing investigations into his criminal network, and the continued turmoil that plagues Australian organized crime. The knife that had been his signature weapon couldn't protect him when his enemies finally caught up with him in a suburban parking lot on a quiet Thursday afternoon. The rise and fall of Mick the Knife wasn't just the story of one man's journey from enforcer to fugitive to corpse. It was the story of a system built on aggression, sustained by fear, and ultimately doomed by its own brutal logic. The black sedan disappeared into the afternoon traffic. carrying with it the secrets of who finally decided that Mick Hawi's time was up. The man who had lived by the blade had died by the bullet, and his story serves as a chilling reminder that in the criminal underworld, everyone's number eventually comes up.